Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DeCosta, and thank you for joining me today on my show called Consistent Preterism. Thank you for always tuning in. Thank you for not getting sick of my voice, and thank you for the support in the midst of great tribulation. Perhaps this is what Jesus spoke of when he spoke of the last days' great tribulation. Perhaps he knew that there would be a remnant of so-called woke people who would understand that the Bible has nothing to do with them and who would be persecuted by the pharisaical, inconsistent prets on Facebook. So I urge you to persevere, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh for you. I'm kidding. But anyways, today I just wanted to talk briefly. I wanted to compare a couple passages. They're going to be from Matthew chapter 19 and Luke chapter 20. We all know the one from Matthew chapter 19. I quote it very often, and I'm not going to quote it verbatim because I'm driving. But it's something along the lines of, Peter asks Jesus a question. Jesus turns around and replies to him and says, those of you who have followed me, for you who have followed me, I, assure you that in the age to come, you will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jesus says this to his disciples, right? The 12 disciples. And he says to them, Peter asks him a question, and Jesus answers the 12 disciples and says to them that, they who have followed him in the age to come, or in the resurrection, or in the regeneration, I think it says in that passage, they would sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, some people out there like to explain things away by saying that everything means nothing. And what I mean by that is they look at these portions that seem to be speaking of a spiritual judgment, or a spiritual realm, or a spiritual catching up, or a spiritual ascending, or whatever the case may be, and they try to explain it away to basically mean nothing, right? Nothing has any meaning. And so, they end up getting to the point where they pretty much have to, just throw up their hands and say, anything can mean anything. Because if it doesn't mean exactly what it says, and it can mean anything, then anyone's guess is as good as anyone's, right? I mean, we can make the Bible mean whatever the heck anybody wants it to mean if it doesn't have real meaning. So when he says in this passage that the disciples would, quote, sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel, the argument's usually made by those who oppose, the literalistic view of things, that I'll give you an example. This would be a typical response from a inconsistent full pret. They'd say, what do you actually think that these disciples sat on 12 thrones up in the sky and judged 12 tribes of Israel up in some spiritual realm? That's ridiculous. Okay, well, my question would be, okay, if you don't believe what it says, then what does it mean? Right? What does it mean? You're unable to give any good, coherent, logical understanding or explanation as to what that could mean. What does 12 disciples sitting on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel actually mean when Jesus said that was going to be the case, or that would take place in the age to come? What does that actually mean? Right? If you're going to dull it down and say, that's all just symbolism for, earthly stuff, then you have to explain what it means, because you're not giving anybody any clarity with that type of a response. Right? And again, it goes back to what I just said. Anyone's guess is as good as anyone's guess in that case. Right? I could say that means that Donald Trump is going to sit on a border wall and judge America. I could say that Snow White and the 7 dwarfs are going to sit on the 12th throne. Like, anything goes. There's nothing concrete about anything in the Bible if you take that approach. It's like just this big spiritual la-la land where anything can just mean anything and nothing is to be taken literal. And I used to do this to a degree, but I've come out of that because I realize the problems that it gets you in, and it traps you, and you end up scratching your head and realizing that you don't have many places to run to once you see things closing in on you. So now what I do is I just take it for what it says, right? I mean, clearly there's things in Scripture that are symbolic, and obviously we know when Jesus said he came for the lost sheep, we know he's not talking about literal lambs, right? But, you know, when these spiritual pictures are presented, I'm not questioning them. I'm not, trying to figure them out, every minute detail and trying to figure out exactly what it means in the spiritual realm or whatever it is. I'm just taking it at face value and believing it. And I'm looking at the pieces and I'm trying to formulate the most logical, explanation as to what it's saying. So when I look at this passage in Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus says that in the age to come, the 12 disciples or apostles would sit on 12 thrones, right? I don't think anybody's going to argue that that's the 12 apostles, correct? I mean, who else would it be, right? The 12 disciples, those who followed him, would sit on 12 thrones, and they would judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? And obviously this has tie-ins to what we see at the end in Revelation and the new city and everything. But these ones are sitting on 12 thrones. So it's clearly the 12 apostles, right? But Jesus said that in the age to come, these 12 apostles were going to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, if we go over to Luke chapter 20, we see what Jesus promised them there. He told them that in the age to come, in the resurrection, which is one and the same, it's the same thing. He said, in the age to come, they would not marry nor give in marriage, because they'd be like angels in heaven and they would never die anymore. All right, so we see that the age to come was going to be characterized by those three things. If you were part of that age to come, you were not going to die anymore, you were like an angel in heaven, and you were not married, because obviously angels don't marry. Okay, so those were the characteristics of the age to come. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus tells them that in the age to come, the 12 apostles would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So we can pretty easily conclude that those who would be like angels, those who would never die anymore, and those who would never marry anymore because they'd be like angels in heaven were the 12 tribes. You see how that works? The age to come was only for the 12 tribes. Paul alludes to this in Acts chapter 26 when he's standing before the council and he says, our fathers, or to which the 12 tribes served God earnestly day and night, hoping to attain. He's speaking of the resurrection. He's speaking of the age to come. They served God earnestly day and night, hoping to attain that promise. And Jesus in Luke 20 said, those who are worthy to attain to it, that being the age to come, would never die, nor would they marry, because they'd be like angels in heaven. But the point that I want to really bring forth here relates to the Apostle John. Obviously, John was one of the 12 apostles. Nobody's going to deny that. There's a lot of speculation and a lot of arguments as to what, happened to John at the coming of the Lord. Those of us who hold to a literal catching up into the clouds, just like Paul and Jesus promised, hold that John was part of that, right? John was not left on the earth when the rest of them went up to be with the Lord and were caught up together with the rest of the dead. John was part of that. He was one of the elect. So, but then you have the other group who reject that sort of idea, and they say that the catching up was nothing more than just a, little, warm, tingly, goosebump feeling that they got when the Lord returned, and nothing changed for them. In fact, most of them who were sort of deported from Jerusalem because of the destruction went on to live these miserable lives in cities where they had nothing. All their possessions were burned up and, destroyed, and many of their family members and friends were absolutely slaughtered and destroyed, and just it was just a horrific event. But yet they want you to think that this most magnificent and glorious event, that being the return of Christ, which they were waiting for, was nothing more than just little goosebumps while they were out in these nations trying to figure out how they would even survive, right? That sounds like a glorious new heaven and new earth to me, doesn't it? Or to you guys, doesn't it? It's quite comical, right? That's the glorious promise that these ones were looking for. That when Christ appeared, they would be like him, and they'd put on immortality, and they would not die, and they would be caught up together in the clouds where they would forever be with the Lord, and he would wipe away every tear from their eyes. That's the glorious promise that they were looking for, and that was fulfilled with nothing more than goosebumps or a little tingly feeling, nothing more than that. And that time frame when that took place was nothing more than them out in the nations, scattered about, having run away from Jerusalem and that whole area, because that, of course, was wiped out. And so now here they are, sort of stranded out in the nations, looking for a place to live, looking for food, looking for work, looking for ways to support themselves. That sounds glorious, doesn't it? What a magnificent inheritance. But that's what these people believe. But again, the focus is on John the Apostle, right? So if the age to come was only for those worthy to attain to it, like Jesus said in Luke chapter 20, that means that there was something that you had to pre-qualify in order to enter into that age to come. And it wasn't an ongoing deal. It was a one-time transferring into that age to come, right? It wasn't for everybody. Inconsistent Prets make the argument that we're in the age to come today, that the age to come is relevant and pertinent to everybody on planet Earth right now, that it just somewhat exists in time, space, wherever it exists here and now on Earth. We are in the age to come. And the age to come, according to these inconsistent full Prets, is for every single person out there. Anyone who just simply believes in Christ enters into the age to come, which is present, but yet they're not in it. So they're not in it if they don't believe, but it's here. But when they do believe, they enter into the age to come, which is here. Do you see the stupidity of these arguments, right? The only way any of this makes sense is if the age to come is totally not of this world, totally in another realm, totally up in the third heavens that Paul was caught up to, right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense if the age to come is here, yet people aren't in it unless they believe in Jesus. It's a stupid argument. But they say that the age to come is here, yet Jesus said only those worthy to attain to that age to come would receive it. So there's a big problem. But let me ask you a question. Did John inherit the age to come? The Apostle John? Of course he did. Why wouldn't he? He was the apostle whom Jesus loved, right? He was the beloved apostle. And Jesus actually even said, if he remains till I come, what is it to you? But what I want you to think about is that statement that Jesus made back in Matthew chapter 19 when he said, in the age to come, or in the resurrection, or in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on his throne. Oh, I just ran a red light. He said the 12 apostles would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, was John not one of the 12 apostles? Of course he was. So therefore, if the age to come was only for those worthy to attain to it, and if it is as people say that John remained on the earth, then how was John sitting on a throne judging the 12 tribes of Israel with the rest of the apostles? Right? I mean, it's a pretty logical and fair argument. Jesus said that in the age to come, the same age to come that only those worthy to attain to it would receive, he said the 12 apostles would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So then if the majority of the apostles had died by the coming of the Lord, which everybody's in agreement with, but if the ones who lived and remained until that coming did not experience a catching away up into the spiritual realm to join those who had already died, then how would all of them collectively sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes in the age to come? Let me repeat that, because that's the main point of this audio. If the majority of the apostles died by the coming of the Lord, which pretty much everybody agrees with. I don't care what position you hold. Okay? If they were dead, asleep, waiting for that resurrection that was going to occur at the Lord's coming, and if only a few of them, 2, 3, however many it was, remained until the coming, then how could collectively all 12 of them sit on 12 thrones in the age to come and judge the 12 tribes of Israel if those who were alive and remained did not get caught up into the clouds, into that spiritual realm, into that age to come, where they would forever be with the Lord with the rest of the dead ones? This just doesn't make sense, because what you'd essentially have is you'd have an age to come. That was the hope of the 12 tribes, like Paul called it. You'd have the 12 tribes in that age to come. You'd have most of the apostles sitting on those 12 thrones, judging them, but you'd still have John and a couple others down on the earth doing whatever the hell they were doing after the gospel ended. Because remember, Jesus in Matthew 24 says, this gospel will go to all nations, and then the end would come. That same end that he encapsulates in this last generation, he said. So the gospel ended at the coming. So what would John be doing after the coming in terms of the gospel? Nothing. The only thing he'd be doing is disobeying the Lord. Because Jesus clearly says the gospel would be preached in all nations, and then the end would come. Jesus clearly told them that to take the Lord's Supper, and by doing so they would proclaim his death until he came. Jesus clearly said that those who endured to the end would be saved. Paul said that at the coming of Jacob's Redeemer, all Israel would be saved. Paul clearly said that Christ would be the first fruits, then those who are Christ would be raised at his coming, then comes the end. Do you see all the finishing, final end statements, the cap statements that put this thing to rest, that end the gospel mission? They're all there. They show that the gospel indeed ended at the coming. So what would John be doing other than disobeying the commands of God? He surely wouldn't be preaching the gospel, I can assure you of that. And if he was preaching the gospel, and if he failed to mention that Christ had come, and that the new heavens, new earth was here, then he's the biggest failure in the history of Christianity, like I always say, because he sets Christianity up for decades and centuries of confusion, disagreement, and discord, and utter chaos, for lack of a better term. So John was an utter failure if he was here on the earth. But if he wasn't, and if he was actually caught up together with the dead in the clouds, just like Paul promised that those who were alive and remained would be, then it would make that promise that Jesus made in Matthew 19 totally believable, and it would make that promise make total sense. Because Jesus said that in the age to come, they would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And you can't sit on 12 thrones. You cannot have 12 thrones full and positioned with judges unless all the apostles are in heaven at the end. And that includes John. So anyways, I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, leave a comment. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. And that's all I got for today, folks. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.